The earliest example we have of a worker complaining about a toxic boss is over 2,500 years old. In the 1960s, an archaeologist found a pottery shard that records a formal complaint by a field worker against his boss. I was harvesting in Hatsar, Assam. When I had measured my harvest and stored it in the granary as always, Hoshiyahu, son of Shobei, came and took my cloak. It was when I had completed my harvest as always that he took my cloak. I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation here. If you speak ancient Hebrew, let me know how I'm doing in a comment. So this worker had already finished his quota and was taking a well-deserved break when his boss came by and accused him of being lazy, took his cloak as punishment, and refused to return it. It's worth noting that a field worker at the time would probably not own any spare clothes, so this cloak would be all he had to wear and to sleep in. The worker is rightfully furious at this unfair treatment. All of my fellows will testify in my favor. Those who harvest with me in the heat of the sun, my fellows will confirm my testimony. I am innocent of guilt. Return my cloak. Sadly, there is no record of the outcome of the complaint, so we'll never know if he got his cloak back. I personally like to think that he did. I think this shows that bad bosses have always existed and can be found in any organization that has bosses. Business, sports, governments, arts, charities, they can be anywhere. For some reason, restaurants seem to be particularly infested with bad bosses. Gordon Ramsay in his early career was a huge jerk who would yell mercilessly at employees or fire them for even the smallest perceived mistakes.
What's the big deal? What if anyone soaked in fogger? Do you want to go home and cry to mummy again? No, like a big wuss? No, Gordon. Guy puts himself in the shit the kitchen, stands there bubbling like a baby.
That must have made the transition to yelling at reality show contestants so much easier. As far back as 3000 BCE, workers who built the pyramids were directed by bosses. They had bosses, and the first known labor protest and strike comes from that era. Workers were building a necropolis, and they complained because they'd not been paid for over a month, while officials did nothing about it. You see, the officials were too busy planning a big celebration for Ramesses III. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. This has continued throughout history. The Industrial Revolution starting in the 1700s gave us much of what we know and hate about the modern workplace. That's when we first got huge corporations with specialized jobs and fixed working hours. It's also when the word manager came into the English language. And that's also when bad bosses first became normalized on an industrial scale. Pun intended. Unemployment and poverty were insanely high in the cities. If a worker stepped even the tiniest bit out of line, there were hundreds of starving people desperate to replace them and get a job and some income. This gave managers complete freedom to mistreat their workers as they wanted, and many of them grabbed that freedom and ran with it. Typical treatment at the time included 100-hour work weeks, super dangerous working conditions, sexual harassment, wage theft, and physical violence against workers. I think it's very telling that the average life expectancy of a factory worker in the 1800s in Manchester was 32. Of course, working conditions have improved since then, fortunately, but that's only because workers and unions fought for it, often literally fought for it, and finally forced passage of worker protection laws. Bad bosses are such a well-known phenomenon that they're even a common media trope and turn up in countless movies and TV shows, usually in comedies.
Hello, Peter. What's happening? I'm gonna need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow. So if you could be here around 9, that would be great. Okay? Oh, and I almost forgot. I'm also gonna need you to go ahead and come in on Sunday, too, okay? We lost some people this week, and we need to sort of play catch-up. Thanks.
Those comedies can be very funny, but I'm just not sure whether they overall serve to warn us of bad bosses or to trivialize the problem by playing it for laughs. Because make no mistake about it, bad bosses are a serious problem. I did a survey some years ago among 1,000 people on the internet and found that if people are unhappy at work, the number one reason is their boss. People said things like, my boss contributes to everything that is bad at work. We have a new director and my job has not changed. Just bosses changed. I used to love my job. Now I hate it. Another comment went, I love my actual job. It is rarely job-specific tasks that make my days go bad. It is almost always frustration about having to work through hierarchy, despite the fact that my boss is recognized as ineffective throughout the organization. Just writing that made my day better. And even if your direct manager is nice, higher-ups can still be jerks. I love my new boss, but the C-suite is clueless and mean. Or how about this one? My VP is an HR nightmare. He constantly makes derogatory remarks about employees behind closed doors during meetings that I'm forced to attend. So how common are bad bosses these days? It is super hard to find exact numbers, but when I look at the various studies I can find, I think it's a fair estimate to say that somewhere around 20% of employees hate their boss. That's a huge number, and it also means that your chances of avoiding them forever are slim to none. You might be watching this video exactly because you think you're working for one right now, but even if you haven't yet encountered a bad boss, if you change jobs every few years, as people tend to do, you will almost inevitably at some point in your career find yourself working for one of these terrible managers. Given that everyone gets to have that highly dubious honor sooner or later, I have 3 goals with this video. First of all, I want to show you how you can recognize a bad boss early on before they cause you too much damage. Second, I want to give you some ideas for what you can do about them. And third, I want to deprogram as many people as possible from just accepting bad bosses as an unavoidable fact of the modern workplace that we must simply learn to live with. They can be avoided and they should never be accepted. But the very fact that people think so makes them more likely to put up with bad bosses and keep working for them. Remember that statistic earlier about how 20% of workers hate their boss? That's bad. That's plenty bad. But it also means that 80% don't hate their boss. The bad bosses are incredibly damaging. We're going to look at the research behind that, but they are still the minority. I think this topic is so important, I literally wrote a book on it. Of course, being the annoyingly positive person that I am, I attacked it from the other angle and looked at good business leadership and how it benefits employees, companies, and society. But in this video, we're going to do a deep dive on bad bosses. How do you recognize them? What kind of damage do they do? Why are they so common? And what can you do about them? We are also going to look at the existing advice that's already out there on how to deal with a bad boss and show how most of that advice is, how should I put this? Exactly 100% completely, totally wrong. But first, how do you know if a boss is bad? Now, it seems logical to try to recognize them by their behavior. That's certainly what much of the current advice out there says. There are a million articles and videos with titles like The 7 Behaviors of a Toxic Manager or 5 Things Bad Bosses Do. But in my opinion, those aren't very helpful because they're never, ever going to be complete because there are just so many ways a bad boss can be bad. Here's a list of just some of the behaviors of bad bosses that have been mentioned across the research on this topic in no particular order. Have you experienced any of these from a manager? Stuff like belittling others, taking credit for other people's work or ideas, bullying, mood swings, unreasonable work demands, never being satisfied with employees' efforts, disregard for employees' well-being, criticizing employees in front of others, not listening to ideas or suggestions, attacking the messenger when given bad news, unclear communication, general incompetence, demanding that employees work outside regular working hours, unfair treatment or favoritism. That's certainly what infuriated that one worker 2,500 years ago when his cloak was taken away. Disregarding workplace safety, being disorganized, bigotry based on race, gender, sexuality, age, or other factors, interrupting others when they're speaking, blaming others for their own mistakes, underpaying employees, wage theft, micromanaging, never recognizing good work, disregarding employees' personal boundaries, never giving feedback, ignoring complaints and problems from employees, criticizing employees personally, sexual harassment, pressuring employees to do things that are unethical or illegal, gaslighting, lying, retaliating against employees who point out problems, seeking status, power, or money for themselves, forcing employees to compromise their professional standards, focusing on how they look to higher-ups, refusing to train or support employees, or constantly monologuing in meetings. The list goes on and on and on, and I'm sure I left out some obvious ones. Write a comment if you've seen behavior from a bad boss that I forgot to put on this list. Now, no boss, no matter how bad, is never going to be doing all of this. At least I really, really hope not. Could you even imagine? So sure, it would be amazing if you could identify bad bosses using some kind of bingo card of bad boss behaviors that you mark whenever your boss does something awful. But that is just not going to work. A boss could be a terrible boss even if they only did one of these things, as long as they did them often enough and with sufficient malice and ingenuity. Also, many of these behaviors are contradictory. I mean, micromanaging employees is terrible and makes them feel belittled and insecure about their work. But the opposite of that, where managers ignore employees completely and never give them direction or feedback, is also bad. Some bad managers are completely disorganized and others are control freaks. Either extreme is bad. They're just bad in different ways. So my point here is that you can't reliably recognize bad bosses by what they do. But fortunately, there is a way that works. You can identify them by how they make you feel. Instead of looking at their specific behavior, look at the effect their behavior has on you and on others. That makes it much, much simpler, because the number one telltale sign of a bad boss is that a bad boss makes you feel bad. They make employees feel ashamed, afraid, angry, stressed, isolated, hopeless, useless, powerless, or singled out, or sometimes all of the above. They make you want to not come to work when they're there and breathe a sigh of relief when they're out of the office. They make your work days terrible, and they even affect your free time so that you spend much of your weekends or your days off dreading having to go back to work. If that's how your boss makes you feel, then you have a bad boss. That's how you can tell. Let me be super clear. No boss ever should be allowed to make employees feel bad at work. I know we have a business culture in many places, especially America, where bad bosses are accepted, or even worse, celebrated as tough and decisive leaders who get results. Later in the video, we're going to see why that is a complete myth and why so many people still fall for it. It should not be normalized. It is not acceptable. If your boss has that effect on you or others, then that is wrong, and you need to recognize it and do something about it. I'm going to talk about specifically what your options are, but the important thing is that you do something, because having a bad boss is not something you can just live with or learn to accept. It can destroy your mental and physical health, your private life, your relationships, and your career. Let's look at how. We've been told that tough bosses are unpleasant, sure, but ultimately their demanding attitude will make you more successful. Think of it as the drill sergeant theory of business leadership. They're tough on you, but it's for your own good.
I am Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, your senior drill instructor. From now on, you will speak only when spoken to. And the first and last words out of your filthy sewers will be, sir. Do you maggots understand that?
Sir, yes, sir.
Bullshit, I can't hear you. Sound off like you got a pair.
Sir, yes, sir.
They break you down, then build you up stronger and better. And, of course, they create better results for the company. Yeah, that turns out to be complete nonsense. There is tons of research that shows just how damaging bad bosses are to your career, your mental and physical health, and your private life. Let's look at some of that. First of all, we know that working for a bad boss hurts your career. They're not invested in your success, only their own. And the second they get a chance to advance their own career by sacrificing yours, I promise you they will jump at it. Also, the constant stress they put on their employees directly hurts their performance, making them less likely to advance in their careers. But I want to make this clear. A bad boss doesn't only harm you at work. The damage extends well into your private life also. Studies have shown that when you work for a bad boss, it hurts your social relationships. It can mess up your romantic relationship with your partner. It hurts your sleep patterns, and it lowers your overall life satisfaction, making you less happy in life. One Swiss study even found that people with bad bosses were less satisfied with their sex lives. So yeah, the stakes are high here. The damage to your physical health can be even worse. According to studies, the stress of working for a bad boss means that people tend to have a more unhealthy diet and exercise less. They make worse lifestyle choices. Living a healthy lifestyle is just hard when that bad boss is on your mind so much of the time. Working for a bad boss has also been associated with an increased risk of sleep disorders, heart disease, strokes, and some forms of cancer, just to mention a few effects. The research is very clear. Working for a bad boss can even kill you. In a massive 10-year study of over 3,000 Swedish men, researchers found that working for a bad manager was linked to an increase in heart attacks that resulted in hospitalization or death. This correlation between a bad boss and heart disease held firm even when they controlled for things like smoking, exercise, education, or income. Researcher Anna Nyberg of the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm said, "This is the first study to prove evidence of a dose-response relationship between concrete managerial behaviors and objectively assessed heart disease among employees." In other words, there was a direct correlation. The longer you work for a bad boss, the higher your risk of hospitalization or death with heart disease. And finally, working for a boss who has power over your career and your livelihood and who treats you like dirt, making you feel awful at work and in your free time, is not good for your mental health either. I know, what a shocker, right? Specifically, we know from the research that working for a bad boss is associated with increased risks of stress, anxiety, burnout, and depression. Another interesting point is that bad bosses don't only hurt the employees they directly mistreat, they also hurt bystanders in the workplace who aren't direct targets themselves, but see it happening to others. So even if a bad boss doesn't go after you, but only your coworkers, you can end up suffering many of the same symptoms. So yeah, bad bosses are really, really bad for you. They're not just an annoyance. Working for a bad boss can destroy your career, it can damage your personal life, it can make you sick or depressed, or it can, worst case, kill you. So the research shows that bad bosses are terrible for employees. We probably all knew that already. But the research also shows that bad bosses are terrible for the bottom line. There are three main reasons why. First of all, bad bosses drive away employees. Monster.com asked 1,000 people who were seeking new jobs why they wanted to change jobs, and 76% said a toxic boss was the reason. It's often said that people take a job for the job but leave it because of the manager, and that certainly seems to be the case here. And make no mistake about it, replacing employees takes a lot of time and money, and new employees need time and training before they can perform as well as their departing experienced workers. So employee turnover is a massive cost for the company. And also ask yourself this: who is most likely to leave a company because of a bad boss? It's those employees who have the skills to easily get a new job, and those employees who have the willpower and determination to improve their own situation. Those are precisely the employees the company can least afford to lose to the competition. And who will the bad managers be left with? They'll be left with only those employees who do not have sufficient relevant skills to find better jobs, and or those who have become so broken down and hopeless that they now accept whatever treatment they get, no matter how toxic. The second reason why bad bosses destroy company results is that they make their staff unhappy, and unhappy employees are much less productive. Research clearly shows that people who hate their jobs are less productive, less creative, less innovative, take fewer risks, are sick more often, don't work as well in teams, don't go the extra mile for the company or for the customers, and are less motivated. It is hard to see how somebody can be engaged and productive and effective in a job they absolutely hate because the manager is a jerk. And the final reason why bad bosses destroy productivity is that being the employee of a bad boss it's so much hard work. Their employees have to waste so much time and mental effort on covering their ass against any mistakes, and on trying to navigate the boss's shifting moods to avoid being yelled at next. It can even lead to situations where employees distrust each other and throw each other under the bus just to avoid being singled out themselves, which of course completely destroys good relationships between coworkers and any chance at creating effective teams. All of that time and energy spent on navigating the boss's tantrums is obviously time and energy that does not go into doing the actual, work they're supposed to be doing. It's not hard to see how that completely tanks a team's productivity. So the whole idea that bad bosses should be tolerated or even celebrated because they create better results for the company has been thoroughly debunked by research. In fact, the evidence shows the complete opposite, that good leaders create better results. Countless studies have found that when the boss is empathetic, kind, positive, and genuinely cares about the employees, the business becomes more profitable. But that raises a question. If bad bosses are so bad, and they are, why are there so many of them? Why have they been around since ancient times? Why do companies still keep them around? And why do many employees accept their behavior and stick around anyway? Sometimes for years, or sometimes until they break down completely. That's a really good question. And as I mentioned before, studies indicate that 20% of employees have a bad boss. That's a shockingly high number, given that the general population is obviously not made up of 20% jerks. The vast majority of, regular people are kind, generous, empathetic, fun, and nice to others. So why are there so many more bad people percentage-wise in management than in the general population? Is management just a role where bad people tend to congregate? Or is it that becoming a manager tends to make a person more of a jerk? Well, if you look at the research, it turns out that it's a little bit of both. So let's look at some of the reasons why bad bosses are everywhere. One reason why is just basic human psychology. Because it turns out that as soon as people get power over others, they tend to start behaving badly. Dr. Keltner of Berkeley has done numerous studies on this, And here he explains my favorite study he's done, the Cookie Monster experiment.
We brought 3 people to the lab. We pointed at one person, we said, you're in charge, right? And so that person kind of felt powerful. And then they had to do this really boring task of like write policies for the university. And they're getting kind of bored. We bring a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Everybody takes one cookie. All groups always leave one cookie on the plate because you don't want to be that person that takes the last cookie. So there's that 4th cookie. And we find high power people, they reach out and take it. And lo and behold, our high power person was more likely to eat with their mouth open, lips smacking, crumbs literally like falling onto their sweaters, you know. It's ridiculous.
I love that. In another study, they had a person standing at a crosswalk and filmed the cars passing by to see if they would stop. And they found that the more expensive the car was, the more likely the driver was to break the traffic rules and just blow through the crosswalk where a pedestrian was waiting to cross. Here's their scary conclusion from all of these studies. As people climb the social ladder and get more money and power, their compassion for others declines. They also behave less ethically and are more likely to lie and to cheat. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people who gain power and authority while still retaining their basic humanity. But I think it's something you have to work at, because our natural tendency is the opposite. Ascending the hierarchy is likely to make someone a jerk. Another reason why bad bosses are so common is that many cultures around the world just accept them, or even worse, they expect them. The Dutch researcher Gert Hofstede defined 6 metrics that describe different cultures around the world, and one of them is power distance. It measures how hierarchical a society is.
In large power distance, inequality in a society is considered a normal part of society. That's the way the world is made. The feeling is that superiors are actually superior beings. They are different kind of people. The relationship between the subordinates and their boss in the large power distance societies, subordinates simply assume, expect that they will be told what to do.
When power distance is high, people accept a hierarchical order in which everybody has a place and which needs no further justification. Challenges to the leadership are not well received. Power distance is high in many countries in Asia and the Middle East, for instance, while the lowest scores are found in Scandinavia, where people are much less likely to put up with nonsense from clueless superiors. I promise you this, if a boss tries to give a Danish employee a direct order, they should probably expect to immediately get the question, why? Of course, organizations often create their own subcultures that have a high power distance, even in countries that may not have it. Now, they never do this explicitly. No organization will come out and openly say that in our company, bosses have absolute power and you should never question their orders or protest against mistreatment. But what they can do is to subtly or less subtly punish everyone who doesn't play along and reward and promote only those who knuckle under to bad management. People who play the game well make it to the top and become bosses themselves. People who accept the game are allowed to stay and be treated badly forever, while anyone who revolts is knocked down or peg or two or simply fired. This is all done from a complete conviction that tough bosses create better results, which we've already seen is absolutely wrong. Another reason why there are so many bad bosses is that they breed and multiply. My all-time favorite book on this topic is The No Asshole Rule by Stanford professor Bob Sutton. He goes through all of the research that shows how damaging jerks at work are, especially jerks in leadership positions. And Sutton specifically says that one of the problems is that assholes breed like rabbits. One of the main ideas in the book, taken both from research on emotional contagion and from research on bullying and interpersonal aggression, is that acting like a demeaning jerk isn't just a personality characteristic that some people have and others don't. There is a lot of evidence that when any of us are around nasty people, we without realizing it, start mimicking their nastiness and suffer from asshole poisoning as well. The organization that you choose to work with can have a huge effect on whether you behave like an asshole or a decent human being. That helps explain why there are so many bad bosses. Their bad behavior makes others around them behave badly too. It's also another reason why you should never work for a bad boss for too long, because there is every risk that it could turn you into an asshole as well. In the beginning of the video, I showed you Gordon Ramsay yelling at his restaurant staff. Why does he do that? Well, as a young chef, Ramsay worked for Marco Pierre White, arguably Britain's first celebrity chef, who also abused his staff and routinely made them cry, including Ramsay. But that was a long time ago. Maybe White has since learned his lesson and taken responsibility for his behavior?
No, I didn't make Gordon Ramsay cry. He made himself cry. That was his choice to cry.
Another reason why there are so many bad bosses is that we tend to accept them. Many people keep working for them even though they recognize their awfulness. If employees never tolerate bad behavior from their boss, bad bosses would have no employees and there would be no bad bosses. I just want to make it clear, I don't say this to blame employees or hold them responsible for their boss's bad behavior. Bad bosses carry all of the blame here. It's just that our societies and workplaces have built up some strong propaganda that makes us less likely to rebel against bad managers. A journalist once asked me about that in an interview, asking, some people work for horrible bosses like the evil restaurant chefs we see on TV. Why do many people still seem to like and respect these bad managers who mistreat them? And without thinking about it, I just instantly blurted out an answer. Stockholm Syndrome. Like terrorists or hostage takers, bad bosses have power over others. They can deny you a raise or cut your pay and hurt your personal finances. They can set you up for failure in your career, give you all the worst work tasks, and make sure you never get promoted by giving you bad reviews. They can make your work days hell in a million different ways. And they can, of course, fire you if they see you as a threat to their autocratic rule. This power differential might help explain why victims of bad bosses subconsciously try to see their side and attempt to rationalize their behavior. And here's another super important point. Bad bosses will often make you feel like you're at fault. They can gaslight you into believing that their awful behavior towards you is normal. That it's your own fault, or that you're just soft and weak for not being able to handle it. It's kind of like an abusive spouse can make their partner believe it's their own fault and make them stay in the relationship in spite of escalating abuse. Do not fall for that. Okay, I want to mention two final reasons that may explain why there are so many bad bosses. But I want to stress that the first one is kind of speculative, and the second one is just my wild-ass conjecture. But first, a quick side note. Did you know that Stockholm Syndrome is a myth? I literally just discovered that during the research for this video. I've heard about it for decades. It's one of those pop psychology terms that everyone knows about and kind of understands what it is. So it may surprise you to hear that there is zero research evidence that people tend to end up sympathizing with their captors in hostage-type situations. And what's more, the origin of the term Stockholm Syndrome is incredibly sexist and patriarchal. So let's take a quick moment to talk about that. The syndrome was first described by Swedish psychologist Nils Bejerot. In 1973, two bank robbers took 4 people hostage for several days in a bank in Stockholm, and the police's handling of the situation was incredibly incompetent. At one point, they're sure they've identified one of the robbers, so they send in his teenage brother. They're sure that will convince him to give up. Now, that's a bad idea in the first place, but it also, even worse, it turns out they've misidentified the bank robber. It's a completely different guy, and the teenage boy, who is absolutely not his brother, has to flee the bank under gunfire. Now, when everything still miraculously ended without injury to the hostages or the robbers, one employee, Kristin Enmark, harshly criticized the police for their actions. And Bayrou, the psychologist, with no evidence and without ever even talking to Enmark, just waved away her criticism. Instead, he publicly said that Enmark had forged an emotional bond with one of the bank robbers and heavily implied that their connection was sexual. Yeah, that's right. Stockholm Syndrome was invented out of thin air by an incompetent man trying to cover his ass by blaming a woman. And no subsequent research has ever managed to show that it's a real psychological effect. I've linked to a more thorough debunking of Stockholm Syndrome in the video description. Check it out. It's fascinating. But let's get back to my two more speculative reasons why there are so many bad bosses. Here's the first one. Neuroscientists have found that damage to some areas of the brain are related to psychopathic behaviors. Subtle damage to the amygdala, a brain region that helps us process our emotions, may explain why psychopaths act so cruelly and cannot express emotions properly. The same can happen if you get an injury to the cerebral cortex, which regulates memory and self-awareness, or the frontal lobe, which is responsible for self-control and judgment. So maybe that jerk you work for is just a jerk. Or maybe he took a golf ball to the head on an executive retreat a few years ago, and that's why he's always treating people like dirt. That doesn't excuse it, but it may explain why some bosses act with complete disregard for the welfare of others. They could quite simply have some form of brain damage. But let's get really speculative and conspiratorial. I have a theory, or really more of a loose conjecture, that bad bosses may be caused by lead poisoning. Lead used to be everywhere around us, especially in paint and as an additive in car fuel. And we've long known that lead is incredibly toxic. The first written account of lead poisoning is from ancient Egypt, where they used it as an ingredient in their eye makeup. Not a good thing to put in your eyes. But we've also known that lead exposure affects behavior since at least the 1940s, when a study found that infants who had chewed the lead-based paint off their cots were more likely to be aggressive and violent even years after they had recovered from acute lead poisoning. Partly because once lead enters the body, it can stay for decades. We also know that exposure to even tiny amounts of lead in infancy leads to an increased risk of criminal behavior in adulthood. Studies have found that if you eliminate lead in a society, crime stats start to drop 20 years later. It is insane to me that this, more than anything else, explains why violent crime rose in the US in the 90s and then fell after. It was not crack cocaine that caused the rise and then tough policing that made it fall, even though law and order politicians would love for you to think that. The increase in crime was driven to a large degree by more atmospheric lead because there were more cars in the streets, and the decrease in crime came because lead additives were prohibited in the early 1970s. Here's a super scary example. Check out this graph of serial killer victims per capita in the US. What do you know? It rises in the 70s and falls in the 90s, 20 years after lead was abolished. It was not easy to abolish lead. Industry lobbyists fought tooth and nail to keep lead in paint and car fuel, and launched an actual harassment campaign against the scientists that were working for a lead ban. Because of course they did. Right now, they're still fighting to keep lead in airplane fuel. Okay, so lead is bad. What does that have to do with bad managers? Alrighty, let's get our tinfoil hats on and connect the dots here.
Check this out. Take a look at this.
We know that lead poisoning in childhood can lead to psychopathic tendencies in adulthood, right? Well established. And who is the last generation to have had that exposure? Well, in the US, they would have been born around 1970. So they would be in their mid-50s now. That's exactly the age where you're most likely to have climbed the corporate ladder and start exerting power over others in the workplace, but not yet have retired. So no, it wouldn't surprise me if one factor behind the high number of bad bosses is brain damage caused by childhood exposure to lead. Again, I want to be very clear. This is pure conjecture on my part. I have no way of knowing if that's the case, and I'm not aware of any research that has checked bad managers for lead exposure in childhood. That would be fascinating, though. But if lead is a factor, then that might actually be good news, because that would mean that the next generations coming into management roles will not have those tendencies to the same degree. In fact, that might explain why millennials and younger generations in our workplaces do not put up with that kind of crap and are much more likely to speak up or quit if they're mistreated. Their brains are not damaged by an incredibly toxic heavy metal. Of course, there is still the risk that younger people in the workplace will become jerks anyway, not from lead poisoning, but through the asshole poisoning that Bob Sutton warned about. Because just being around the jerks that are currently in management can make you a jerk, as we saw. That's why we can't just sit around and wait for the current generation of bad bosses to age out and retire from their jobs. Their negative effects could linger for a long, long time. Just like lead poisoning. I am getting a lot of mileage out of that analogy. It absolutely boggles my mind, but some people are actually out there defending bad bosses. Their main argument typically goes something like this. What about Steve Jobs? What about Elon Musk? What about Michael Jordan? They all are or were huge jerks, but look how successful and rich they are. Doesn't that prove that being a jerk is necessary to achieve success? Doesn't that prove that being a bad boss is okay? Is that a good argument? I want you to imagine this scene. Steve Jobs is on his deathbed. His daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs, who he refused to acknowledge for years, is there to say goodbye. And trying to make it as pleasant as possible for her dad, she puts on some rosewater face mist so she'll smell good.
For the past year, I'd visited every weekend, every other month or so. I'd given up on the possibility of a grand reconciliation, the kind in movies, but I kept coming anyway. Before I said goodbye, I went to the bathroom. I found a bottle of expensive rose facial mist. I sprayed it up into the air and closed my eyes. As I came into his room, he was getting into a standing position. When we hugged, I could feel his vertebrae, his ribs. He smelled musty, like medicine sweat. "I'll be back soon," I said. We detached, and I started walking away. "Lise? Yeah? You smell like a toilet." It was the rose spray. And this is one scene of many.
This example is not just him lashing out because he's dying and in pain. This is who he was. At Apple, he'd routinely make employees cry or assault them verbally in meetings. He didn't seem to care that he was hurting them. Foxconn, Apple's leading supplier in China, experienced a wave of suicides among employees who jumped off the roofs of the buildings because they were constantly overworked and treated like dirt. And Jobs' reaction at the time was criticized for being incredibly callous and for demanding no real change from Foxconn. Foxconn did eventually address the issue. They put up nets around the buildings so people could no longer jump to their deaths. Jobs was definitely a marketing genius, but that is not the only key to Apple's enormous success. Apple became successful partly because some people inside the company worked to negate his worst behavior. One book reported that Steve had a group that was strong enough to deal with who he was and autonomous enough to compensate for his weaknesses. They developed their own tactics for managing him, and navigating his aggression bonded them together. One of them said, "It was like we had a common enemy." When I watched The Last Dance, Netflix's documentary about Michael Jordan's time at the Chicago Bulls, I was struck by one thing in particular. Given that Jordan had complete control over the series and got to approve everything in it. It's amazing to me how badly he comes off, how bad he looks in the show. The show reveals how Jordan would, routinely yell at and belittle his teammates, his own teammates and coaches in practice and in games, eventually driving some to break down and leave the team. He held grudges for years and came across as incredibly vindictive in the documentary that he fully approved. If anything, he kind of looks like he revels in his pettiness.
During the finals, we go out to dinner one night. George Carl's over on the other side, having dinner. Hey, there's George Carl over there. And George Carl does not come over and speak to him. He walked right past me. Now look at Musk. Really? Okay, fine. That's all I needed. That's all I needed for him to do that. And it became personal with me.
Jordan's awful behavior continued long after he left the Bulls. Kwame Brown is often mentioned as an example of a young NBA star who never lived up to his potential. He was drafted to play for the Washington Wizards, where Michael Jordan also played. And that was probably the worst thing that could have happened to a young, talented player, according to an article in Sports Illustrated. As a leader, Jordan proved more tormentor than mentor. Many Washington players got the business end of a Jordan harangue, but he designated second-year forward Kwame Brown as the whipping boy, calling him expletives, including homophobic remarks. Jordan routinely reduced Brown to tears in front of the team. I do not care how good you are with a basketball. That is despicable behavior.
There's a whole lot more stories that we can tell too, that of MJ doing disrespectful things to you, and specifically to demean you. And people giggling about it while it was happening.
But my favorite Jordan story may just be this one. Jordan was visiting the home of his North Carolina teammate Buzz Peterson and played a casual game of cards against Peterson's mom. When the woman went to the bathroom, Buzz caught Jordan trying to cheat. Yeah. And then we have Elon Musk. Elon Musk, the Tony Stark you got off Wish.com. I really think he's the current leading poster boy for this whole syndrome now that Steve Jobs is dead. I've made some videos already on Musk's terrible treatment of the staff at Twitter since he took over. I'm not calling it X. I'm never going to call it X. But let's not judge Musk by the absolute disaster of his time at Twitter. That's only been going on for less than a year, and it's still somehow inexplicably getting worse. What about Tesla and SpaceX? They're successful, right? Sure. But that's partly in spite of Musk. SpaceX specifically has a team of people whose job it is to distract Musk away from actually running the business and to make sure that any nonsensical decisions he makes are ignored. And Tesla has actually been doing better for the last year, while Musk has been distracted with running Twitter into the ground. With running Twitter. At all his companies, Musk is known for making insane demands, for ignoring workplace safety and work-life balance concerns, and for rage-firing employees on a whim. But my favorite Musk story is still the one where he exposes himself to a flight attendant on his personal jet and offers her a horse if she'll have sex with him. She sued, that's good for her, and the company settled for $250,000, a cool $250,000. Because, yeah. I think we can safely conclude that these guys are not only horrible bosses, they're awful human beings all around. Remember that research on how people who get power become less likely to care about others and more likely to lie and cheat? Yeah, that's exactly what we see here. But somehow, some people still hold them up as paragons that we should learn from and emulate. Silicon Valley tech bros are currently looking at Musk's reign at Twitter and gleefully rubbing their hands together, thinking they've been given license to be just as awful bosses. Steve Jobs has long been the poster boy for asshole execs in every industry who think that his bad behavior excuses their bad behavior. And the Norwegian chess grandmaster Magnus Carlsen said in an interview that he'd been watching The Last Dance, and then he added this: "There have been people saying in Norway, you don't have to be an asshole to win. Whenever they say that from now on, I'll say, go and watch Jordan. And I'm going to use that as an excuse for any questionable behavior." It's also interesting that those who choose to defend people like Musk, Jobs, and Jordan freely admit that these are not good people. They're not trying to make them out to be, good and kind and empathetic. They just believe that the results they get justify their behavior, and that anyone who becomes as rich as them must have been justified in everything they did to get there, because why else would they have succeeded? Mark my words, it's only a matter of time before some Musk fanboy writes a comment on this video complaining about, how can you criticize Elon when he's so much richer than you? As if success means that you're doing the right thing. Newsflash, a lot of people become very rich by doing the wrong thing, by lying, stealing, cheating, and abusing others. So the conclusion that because these people are successful, that means their behavior is justified is completely wrong for three main reasons. First, none of them created their results alone. I mean, they're happy to take all the credit, but they all had incredibly talented people around them who also made massive contributions. Scottie Pippen, anyone? In fact, often they have talented people around them whose job is specifically to make sure they don't screw things up too badly, like we saw Musk has at SpaceX. Second, while they're certainly overall successful, I think it's telling how their defenders always completely ignore their failures. I mean, after leaving the Bulls, Michael Jordan played 2 seasons with the Washington Wizards. He said he wanted more championships, but they never even made it to the playoffs. Steve Jobs had a long list of failed products like the Next computer or the Apple Newton, and Musk's list of business promises that he's failed to deliver on is tremendously long. Just as an example, he's promised to put people on Mars by 2022, but the rocket that's supposed to bring them there still has not made it into Earth orbit without blowing up. Are you trying to tell me that if only Jordan had been more of an asshole, the Wizards would have won a championship? Or if Musk had been even more of an awkward, self-obsessed weirdo, his rocket would not have blown up? Yeah, I don't know, that seems unlikely to me. But third, and most importantly, there is no way of knowing if these people are successful because they're terrible people, as their defenders claim. I know they want you to think that because it excuses any bad behavior and gives them license to be jerks too. But to me, it seems far more likely that Musk, Jordan, and Steve Jobs could have gotten even better results if they did not treat other people like dirt. That is certainly what the research says, as we saw previously. Bad bosses are bad for business. And they could have achieved even better results by not abusing others. Tons of very successful business people do. So I think that the automatic assumption that these people are successful because they're assholes is very problematic. But I also want to make this point very clear. Even if their behavior were good for business, which it isn't, but even if it were, it would still be wrong. Now, unless you're Danish, you have probably never heard of the philosopher K.E. Løstrup. His work has been highly influential in Scandinavia, and he presented his most famous ideas in his 1956 book, The Ethical Demand. Here's how he explains the basic concept. You never deal with another person without holding a portion of their life in your hands. It may be very little, a passing mood, an enthusiasm you cause to grow or wither, a revulsion you deepen or alleviate. But it can also be a terrifying amount, so that it is up to you whether the other person's life succeeds or not. By our very attitude to another, we help to shape that person's world. And herein lies the unarticulated and one might say anonymous demand that we take care of the life which trust has placed in our hands. To paraphrase, Løstrup says that you never interact with another human being without holding a little bit of that person's life in your hand, and that you have an ethical responsibility for how you affect that person. In other words, it is our duty to treat those around us in a way that makes their lives better, not worse. This applies in every aspect of life, but in the workplace, we can fall into a pattern of thinking that puts other concerns first, typically the bottom line. Our attitudes towards other human beings can be negatively affected by time pressure, economic pressure, performance pressure, and so on. And as we've seen, people very quickly adopt the norms and behaviors of those around them, and toxic leadership or cultures rapidly make people act in ways that border on sociopathic. But, says Løstrup, it doesn't matter what types of pressure your job puts on you. He argues that none of that gives you license to treat other people with less than the utmost respect and care. Indeed, he says, we have an ethical demand to treat others well. And this goes double for bosses whose behavior, good or bad, is always seen by employees and quickly adopted as the new norm. If you're not into obscure Danish philosophers, then Immanuel Kant said kind of the same thing. Kant's categorical imperative states that humans are required never to treat others merely as a means to an end, but always as ends in themselves. So no, you cannot sacrifice the well-being of your employees in order to achieve better business results. It doesn't work, first of all, but even if it did work, it would still be morally and ethically wrong. Anyone who says otherwise is probably just looking for an excuse to never have to critically examine and question their own bad behavior. So, I hope I've convinced you by now that bad bosses are terrible for employees and for the business and should never be tolerated. Sadly, as we've seen, some people disagree, and that explains why they're still around in scary large numbers. So that means you will, in all likelihood, run into one sooner or later. What should you do about it? What do you do if you're working for a bad boss right now? Well, the first thing you should do is ignore 99% of the advice that's already out there. I have looked at a buttload of articles and videos with advice on this topic, and nearly all of it is about how you can learn to adapt to a toxic boss. Here's a typical example, a video called How to Deal with a Difficult Boss. The video has 6 tips. Focus on your job, know what's important to your boss, don't try to fix your boss, stay aligned with your values, put yourself in their shoes, and take another look at how you're approaching things. I don't know why there are 6 points. I can sum that up in 1 point. Shut up and take whatever your boss is dishing out. I wish I could say that was a rare example, but that really is the gist of by far the most of the advice out there on this. Don't try to change bad bosses, just accept their behavior and try to deal with it as best you can. That's nonsense. That is terrible advice. But it actually gets even worse. The single dumbest piece of advice I found on this was in this video by someone called Jocko Willink.
So what you got to be careful of, what you don't want to do is create an antagonistic relationship with him, and that includes threatening him with your work ethic, threatening him with your performance level, threatening him with your skills. So you almost have to throttle back just a little bit enough that he's not threatened. Now, the other thing you could do instead of throttling back is what you do is you give him the credit.
The credit, yeah.
And you give him the credit, you're good. And now he's like pumped.
Yep.
If you do it right, you will rise to the top. If you screw it up, you'll never rise. If you create an antagonistic relationship with him, you will not promote. If you do it right, you will end up above him in the chain of command. It will take time. It will take swallowing of pride. But it will happen. It might take 5 years. It might take 7 years.
I wish Jocko was joking, but he's not. He's made the exact same point in several different videos, and he has 1.7 million subscribers on YouTube, so a lot of people are apparently listening to his crap advice. That's bad, because here's what he's saying. If you work for a manipulative Machiavellian boss, all you have to do is be more manipulative and Machiavellian than them. He specifically says to let them have all the wins so you can butter them up and get on their good side. You know what, Jocko? That is never, ever going to work. Bad bosses are not rational people. They can lash out at anyone at any time for any reason. Trying to appease them is a lot like sacrificing a virgin to a volcano to keep it from erupting, and it's about as unlikely to work. And why the hell would anyone want to spend 5 to 7 years working for an incompetent manager? Can you even imagine how much it would suck to go into work every day, year after year, and having to either pretend to be bad at your job so you don't threaten your boss's fragile ego, or give them credit for all of your hard work? It would be so much better for your career to just find a new job and then work 5 years for a company that actually cares about having competent managers. But no, says Jocko, stick around, play the game, swallow your pride. Please don't. In fact, what Jocko is suggesting is going to make everything worse, because you have now become exactly the kind of manipulative jerk that you're trying to fight. This is exactly what Bob Sutton was talking about when he said that bad bosses breed like rabbits. And if you follow this idiot's advice, you're about to become the next rabbit. Or as Lily Tomlin brilliantly put it, the trouble with the rat race is that even if you win, you're still a rat. So, almost all of the tips already out there on how to deal with a bad boss should absolutely be ignored. It's almost like a lot of the advice you'll find in business magazines on this only serves to cement the status quo. What a strange coincidence. But there are some things you can do. I have 3 recommendations for what you should do if you find yourself working for a bad boss. First, classify your bad boss. Now, this may just be my irrepressible optimism coming out, but I honestly believe that a lot of bad bosses don't want to be bad. Yes, there are psychopaths in management who almost, seem to enjoy hurting other people, but they are the minority of bad managers. Many bad managers have no ill will, but have fallen into patterns of bad behavior for the reasons we looked at earlier. And if that's the kind of manager you work for, then there's a chance that they can learn. If you and your coworkers talk to them honestly and directly and lay out what bad behaviors you've noticed and how it hurts the team, then there's a chance that they can learn to do better. Can bad bosses learn? Well, some can. I talked to one CEO of a tech company who told me that he used to be an asshole. He explained that he used to be this hard-nosed, demanding leader who made his employees and himself miserable, but he never realized it. One of his friends calls him on it, and he starts changing his behavior for the better. He explains the results like this. One of the most crucial things I've changed is to trust people. Earlier, I did not trust people, and they behaved accordingly. I, as the leader, had to be the first one to offer trust between us. The other way around does not work. I am now much happier and relaxed at work. My employees are happier and more productive, and I don't feel completely isolated in the company, like all the responsibility is on my shoulders alone. Oh, and the company is doing better and growing faster. So yes, some bosses can learn to do better, but they have to want to. Try and figure out if your bad boss is in that category. But secondly, and also, your best option might well be to quit. You can either leave the company completely or move to a different team with a better manager inside the same organization, assuming, of course, that asshole contagion hasn't yet infected all the managers in your workplace. Quitting is especially important if you work for a boss with psychopathic personality traits or someone who just does not want to learn how to not hurt their employees with their toxic behavior. Because if that's the case, then you need to get away. And you need to get away now. It's tempting to wait it out in the hopes that your awful boss might get promoted out of there. But the sad reality is that even if that happens, their replacement could be just as bad or worse. I mean, your workplace has already demonstrated that it is absolutely willing to tolerate terrible people in management positions and is probably going to do it again. But here's the good news. No matter how much of a jerk your boss is, no matter how much power they exert over you, no matter how many ways they find to come at you, there is one freedom that you always have, and that is the freedom to walk away. There is nothing they can do to stop you from walking out the door, and they can't show up at your house every morning and force you to come into work at gunpoint. You are free to leave. Use that freedom. I made a whole video on quitting where I talk about how to know if it's time to quit your job, how to do it, and why quitting is often the best move for your career, your health, and your peace of mind. In that video, I also debunk the anti-quitting propaganda that keeps so many people stuck in bad jobs. If you ever heard that quitting is weak or that winners never quit and quitters never win, then you've been subjected to exactly that kind of nonsense. You may feel like quitting means that your boss wins over you, but honestly, leaving bad bosses is the best thing you can do for yourself and also one of the best ways to stick it to them. Every time an employee quits, the company has to spend a lot of time and money to recruit a new employee and train them. The rule of thumb is that replacing an employee costs the business at least a year's salary. Maybe you can even convince some of your coworkers to also get away. Imagine if that bad boss just lost most of their employees over a short period of time. That would definitely hurt them. I've linked to my video on quitting below. If you feel like maybe you should quit, but you're not sure how, that video may help. Also, just a quick final tip for something we can all do, even if we don't currently have a bad boss. Don't shop at companies that mistreat their employees. If you know that a certain store, restaurant, bank, or online retailer treats their employees terribly, don't spend your money there. Go to their competitor that actually treats their employees like goddamn human beings. What if you can't get away? I mean, maybe there are no open jobs in your area for someone with your skills. Maybe unemployment is high, or maybe you can't quit because you're American and you and your family's health insurance still depend on your job because you still have that idiotic system. Then what do? Here are some quick tips. First and most importantly, start working towards getting away. Get your CV up to date, start searching job sites, start applying for jobs, or figure out where you could apply. You could also start saving up money so that you're financially able to quit even without finding a new job first. You may not be able to quit right now, but if you start working towards it now, then the day will come when you can. Also, this will give you hope that one day you will escape that awful boss. And psychological research shows that having hope is crucial for your mental health. Second, do everything you can to spend less time around that bad boss. Can you work from home? Can you work fewer hours? Can you take up tasks away from the workplace where the boss is? Can you schedule your hours differently so you have more time at work where they're not around? Also, if you can somehow game the system and make it look like you work more hours than you actually do to get your boss off your back, then you should absolutely do that. I give you permission. As we saw from the Swedish study, they documented a dose-response effect from bad management. So the more you're around them, the worse it gets for you, the more they affect you, the more likely you are to suffer physical or mental health effects. Third, you can also consider banding together with your coworkers, provided you can trust them. If your boss has already managed to pit everyone against each other, then that's not going to work. But otherwise, talking to your coworkers about your bad boss can be a good idea. It can help you see that it's not just in your head, but an actual problem. And you can help each other cope and plan a strategy together. If your workplace has a union, you could absolutely go to them. It's what they're there for. Should you go to HR? That depends. Can you trust them to protect you and not the bad boss? Again, if your workplace has been infested with jerk bosses for a while, they will probably have arranged it so that HR is now serving them and not the employees. And finally, if there's just no way for you to quit right now, it becomes really important to remember that whatever treatment you receive is not about you. It's because your boss has a terrible personality and quite possibly some form of brain damage. Why should you care about their opinion of you when it's not about you at all? This is obviously easier said than done, and it's definitely not a good long-term strategy. Unless you're incredibly mentally resilient, a bad boss will wear you down eventually. But here and now, in the short term, it can be a survival tactic to just withdraw emotionally from your job as much as you can. Stop caring what your boss thinks of you. You're only doing this job for a while until you can get away and your escape is on the horizon. Companies themselves also need to do whatever they can to stop bad bosses, both because bad bosses hurt people, and that's just morally wrong, but also because bad bosses cost the company a ton of money, as we've seen. Here's what companies can do. The ultimate solution for the problem of bad bosses might just be to have no bosses. Do we even actually need managers? Many companies around the world in many different industries function perfectly fine without them, including some very big and successful ones. You may not have ever heard of Morningstar Tomato, but if you've ever had a pizza in the US, you have almost certainly eaten their products. Douglas Kirkpatrick, who helped start the company, explains how it works.
We became the largest tomato processor in the world, and we did it all without a single human boss. At the core of Morningstar's eccentric yet effective management model is a simple idea: freedom. There's no command authority. No one can direct the activities of others. No one can go up to a colleague and say, stop doing X and start doing Y. Leadership is earned through trust, communication, and respect. It's not conveyed by title. There are no titles.
You may think this is a radical idea, but there are tons of workplaces all over the world in all kinds of industries who operate like this. I myself co-founded a tech company in Copenhagen in 1997 that operated democratically without bosses, so I know firsthand how well it works. I may talk more about this in a future video. Write a comment if you're interested in that topic. But the reality is, of course, that most businesses have bosses today. So how do you make sure that they're good bosses and not bad bosses? The amazing book, Everybody Matters by Bob Chapman has some of the answers. The book tells the story of how Bob himself went from a hard-nosed CEO who only cared about profits to being the kind of leader who puts their employees first. In his company, Barry Waymiller, people matter. Working there should be a positive factor and make their lives better overall. But why has Bob chosen this approach? When I interviewed him for my book, he put it very clearly. Leadership is the stewardship of the lives entrusted to you. It starts with our fundamental responsibility for the lives of people who we have the privilege of leading. Everybody wants to know that who they are and what they do matters. And when you genuinely show them that you care, it profoundly affects their lives. This is exactly what that obscure Danish philosopher K.E. Løstrup was talking about. Bob believes that leading someone in the workplace is a privilege that carries with it a responsibility to lead them well. And when we do that, we can profoundly affect their lives for the better. The Danish company Carl Ras make a bold statement. There are no bad managers in our company. The company sells tools to professional builders and have 400 employees around Denmark. How can they possibly make sure that they don't have a single bad manager? There are three main ways they do that. First, they recruit managers from within. That way, they already know who these people are and that they understand the culture they need to create. Second, they train the leadership skills of all managers. They actively train managers on how to lead well. And third, they measure how happy employees are with their managers so they can be sure that there are no bad bosses. The results speak for themselves. At Carl Ras, 97% of employees say management is honest and ethical. 96% say management trusts employees, and 98% of employees say this is a really good place to work. That's just remarkable. Another thing companies can do is be ultra careful when they hire managers or promote people to management positions. One of my favorite business books ever is The Customer Comes Second by Hal Rosenbluth, where he describes how he built a workplace where employees came first. And part of that is being incredibly careful who you hire for management positions. In the book, Rosenbluth shares this story about how he was once about to hire an executive who seemed to have all the right skills, the right personality, and the perfect CV. And in the job interviews, he said, he said all the right things, but there was like something about him was off. Something about him made Hal Rosenbluth nervous, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. So here's what he did. He invited the applicant to join a company softball game. Yeah? Supposed to be just like a chill, low-key, fun affair. But this is where the guy showed who he really was. He was competitive to the point of being manic. He abused and yelled at both the opponents and his own team, shades of Michael Jordan. And he cursed at the referees and kicked up dirt like a Major League Baseball player. And he didn't get the job. The higher up the pyramid the position is you're hiring for, the more important it becomes to make sure that you're not hiring a jerk. Softball games may reveal a person's true character, but here's another very simple solution. Talk to some of their previous employees. I mean, they know what kind of person you're dealing with. It seems like a complete no-brainer, but to the best of my knowledge, no company does this. Write a comment if you know of a company that actually interviews the previous employees of a boss they're about to hire. As a company, you also need a way to identify bad bosses inside the organization so you can do something about them. I once did some work for a division of a big Danish bank, and they told me that every year when they did their annual job satisfaction survey, the same handful of teams were miserable. They also told me that everyone knew why the managers of those teams were awful, but no one ever did anything about it. That is just about the worst thing you can do. Ask people for their opinion and then completely ignore them when they point out the problems they're facing. What companies need to do instead is to regularly ask employees how they feel about their boss. Then, if the answers are not good enough, they can train that manager to lead better. And if that doesn't work, they need to get rid of those managers. Fire them. Get them out of there. In fact, here's a tip. If a company really wants to stick it to the competition, they should identify all of their own worst managers and then help them get jobs with their competitors. Screw everything up over there. One Danish trade union even proposed creating a national register of bad bosses so companies would know who to avoid hiring and employees would know who to avoid working for. And finally, last tip for companies. Companies can introduce a wider no asshole rule that goes both for employees but especially for managers. The Australian software company Atlassian has done that. In 2019, they redesigned their performance reviews to look less at the actual work and more on interpersonal behavior. And they specifically said that they will not tolerate brilliant jerks, employees who get great results by mistreating others. I love that. And of course, managers themselves can work on not being bad managers. I mean, start with yourself. That's just obvious. Now, I seriously doubt if a lot of managers will end up watching this video. I especially doubt that any of the bad bosses will see it. Unless, of course, tons of you start anonymously sending this video to your bad bosses. Hint. Hint. It's one of the supreme ironies of life that the people who most need to change their bad behavior are the most likely to avoid or ignore any good advice on how to do it. But hey, maybe you are a manager, or maybe you're going to be one someday. I mean, it can happen to the best of us, or indeed the worst of us. Maybe you're going to start your own business at some point and will have employees and don't want to completely ruin their lives. Here are 3 quick tips for what managers can do themselves to avoid being bad bosses. First of all, you're going to have to deprogram yourself from nearly everything you may have learned explicitly in business school or implicitly throughout your career. The established thinking on what it means to be a boss is wrong beyond salvaging. I'm thinking of stuff like, it's cold at the top, you can't be friends with your employees, it's a dog-eat-dog world, you can't trust anyone at work, everybody's just in it for themselves, people are so lazy no one wants to work, or I'm the boss, I call the shots, it's my way or the highway. All of these perfectly common sayings and beliefs are meant to legitimize and perpetuate the actions of bad bosses and to create a culture where their terrible behavior is never challenged or called out. Don't fall for any of it. Also, remember this. As we saw before, even if you become a manager with every intention of being good to your employees, our natural tendency when we get power over others is to start caring less about them and start caring more about ourselves. But the good news is that now that you know about this effect, you're in a much better position to resist it in yourself and others. My second tip for any boss who wants to be a good boss is to fundamentally reshape your idea of what business leadership is all about. Currently, business leadership serves primarily to boost the bottom line of the company and the leader's own wealth and status. A successful leader is one who creates those results, and if you have to be ruthless and tough to get there, well, that's just too bad. What we need is a completely different idea of leadership, where the main goal of a leader is to serve those they lead and work towards a better world for all. This isn't even a new idea. Robert Greenleaf wrote an essay in 1970 that included this passage. A servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. While traditional leadership generally involves the accumulation and exercise of power by one at the top of the pyramid, servant leadership is different. The servant leader shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. One of my favorite examples of this is David Marquet, who was an actual captain on an actual nuclear submarine in the actual US Navy. Now, you may think of the military as the ultimate bastion of authoritarian, tough, top-down leadership. And that's certainly what David thought.
If I gave great instructions, I'd have a great submarine. After all, isn't that what captains of submarines do? Helm left full rudder, dive make your depth 400 feet, ahead flank. I'd watch the movies.
But when he became captain of the USS Santa Fe, he chose a completely different approach. He kind of had to.
Well, the plan changed, and just 1 week before I was scheduled to take command of this submarine, the Navy said, no, you're not going to the USS Olympia. You're going to go to the USS Santa Fe. Now, the Santa Fe was the submarine that we all laughed at. She was the worst performing, worst morale, worst retention submarine in the United States Navy. She had trouble getting underway on time. When she made a repair, she had to do it again, and sometimes even again. The year before this, of the 135 people in the crew of the Santa Fe, exactly 3 decided to stay in the Navy and re-enlisted. I was petrified. I was scared because I was trained for the Olympia, and the Santa Fe is a different submarine.
So he decided to give no orders and set his people free to do what they thought was best, knowing what the mission at hand was.
So I said, look, I'm not going to give any more orders, because if I give an order and you follow it and it's the wrong order, we're all going to die. It focuses the mind.
That way, he was not a bottleneck, and the crew on the submarine felt more trusted and engaged. He tells the story in his amazing book, Turn the Ship Around, and I'll also link to a talk by him in the video description. The results were phenomenal, and I can't help but think that if this kind of leadership can work in a culture as stiff and hierarchical as the US Navy, and in the high-pressure, high-stakes environment of a nuclear submarine, then I'm convinced it can work anywhere. And my third and final tip for anyone who wants to be a good boss is just to do your very best to avoid lead poisoning and other forms of brain damage. So, let me just hammer this point home one more time. We need to stop normalizing bad bosses. Their cheerleaders desperately need us to keep believing that their behavior is somehow justified by the success they've achieved, that it's somehow morally acceptable to drive employees into depression, burnout, or even an early grave as long as we create enough shareholder value when we do it. It's not okay. It never was and it never will be. It's just a myth, and it's a myth that's been thoroughly debunked by evidence, and a myth that is actively hurting people. I mean, sure, you could go along with it, as some people suggest. You could play the game and become a jerk boss yourself, and it might even pay off. It might. But if you do that, you will be hurting a lot of other people just to increase your status and wealth, and you've got to know deep down that that's never, ever going to be morally okay. And even worse, by playing the game, you're actively working to prop up the system and create even more jerks at work. Every single employee deserves to be treated with empathy and respect, and the research is very clear that bad bosses hurt employees and the bottom line. But here's the good news. We can stop being a part of it. Without employees willing to put up with them, there can be no bad bosses. That's why you need to be able to recognize a bad boss and know what to do about them. What do you think? Have you ever had a bad boss, and what did it do to you? What did you end up doing about it? Or am I just a goddamn hippie commie for not being able to see that Musk is a noble role model, and if he has to break a few thousand employees to make a Twitter omelet, then that's just how it has to be. Write a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions. And if this video has helped you at all, consider liking and subscribing. Stay happy.